Drug discovery is becoming more expensive and producing less results than ever before. Why? Partly due to middlemen called contract research organizations, or CROs. When a pharma or biotech company needs a clinical trial doing, they often call up a CRO to do it for them.
Hey, what's happening? We've got a promising new drug and we need a clinical trial. What's the price?
It could be a little, it could be a lot. I don't know. Shut up.
Can we get a ballpark figure?
Well, a pivotal clinical trial for one of your drugs, that's gonna cost you like $20 to $30 million. But for every drug that makes it onto the market, you're gonna need 30 to 40 of those trials. So all in all, it'll be like $2 to $3 billion per drug. Capiche?
Do you take Amex?
Okay, I'm messing around here, but as Charlie Munger says, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. CROs are incentivized to make these clinical trials as bloated and inefficient as possible because they're effectively paid by the hour. Imagine you were paid to wash cars by the hour. Would you try and wash lots of cars? Or would you take your sweet old time on one? Check Twitter, maybe have a cigarette break? Well, that's the situation Lindus Health are trying to fix. They're the hot new challenger on the block, and they've run almost 100 trials through their platform and just raised their $18 million Series A round, with investors including legendary tech billionaire Peter Thiel. Thank you to Miti Taya, also an investor, for introducing me to Lindus CEO Meri Beckwith.
For as long as I can remember, I've been obsessed with the problem of productivity in life sciences, basically. So how we develop new medicines, new treatments. I mean, essentially, the productivity around life sciences has been getting exponentially worse. So there's this thing called Eroom's law, which describes the exponential increase in cost to develop a new drug, a new medicine over the last, since 1950, over the last 70 years. That's pretty terrifying when you think about it. One of our most important industries is getting, exponentially less efficient. And so I've always been obsessed with, why this was happening and whether there was anything we could do to solve it. And, as I was working in venture capital, investing in early stage kind of health tech, life sciences companies, and the answer started to dawn on me because, essentially, most of the cost to develop new medicines, new health treatments, are the cost of clinical trials to show those treatments are safe and effective. And what I was seeing on the ground with, early stage biotechs, digital health companies, was that, when it came to running these clinical trials, just outcomes were really bad and frustrating. They were always kind of over budget, late, and, there were just always problems. And then I had a kind of a separate experience when I volunteered to take part in a few clinical trials as a participant, including one of the big COVID vaccine phase 3 trials. And that was just totally shocking because it was just unbelievably chaotic. And in particular, I could, just the way the trial was set up, I could tell they were just capturing very poor quality data, as well as ridiculous stuff the company running the clinical trial couldn't build a website properly, so I had to download Internet Explorer to even sign up, et cetera, et cetera. That's sort of the high-level background. And I think what was the trigger to founding Lindus was I realized that, most pharma companies or biotech companies will hire a commercial company called a contract research organization, CRO for short, to actually run their clinical trial. And it's this huge industry. It's kind of a huge industry that not many people are aware of, but, $60-70 billion, give or take. And essentially, these CROs sit at the middle. They kind of have total budget control over how the clinical trial runs, but they just do a terrible job. And this is what came up again and again in conversations with everyone from pharma execs down to kind of biotech founders. And, from these experiences of working in venture capital and also being on the clinical trials myself, I realized that the CRO model was just really broken and needed to change. And that kind of sets the stage for what we're doing at Lindus Health.
Meri, some people hate injustice, some people hate traffic, and you hate contract research organizations. Can you talk about why they exist, why pharma and biotech use these CROs? If they are so terrible, why are they using them?
Well, I guess there are two reasons for this. So firstly, in the 90s, this industry, despite being kind of big and very clunky, it's actually only been around for sort of 20 or 30 years, really 20 years. So in the 90s, everyone used to run their own clinical trials, overwhelmingly pharma. But then pharma realized they had so much kind of pricing power in the market, they could just sort of, outsource that as a way to save cost. and then just do what they're doing today, where pharma is almost like an investment bank, where they just sort of move money between different programs and then maybe do distribution when things get approved. So this kind of then created the CRO industry as these companies you could outsource like running the clinical trial to. This also worked for biotechs, as like the biotech industry has grown because, virtually no biotechs have the resources to be able to build their own like clinical operations, internal capability to run clinical trials, in addition to all the other stuff they do around kind of target discovery and so on. So this sort of created the clinical trial industry. And then also there's like a regulatory component to it where the regulations don't mandate this, but they're sort of written with a view to like, there are aspects of like clinical trial monitoring and sort of patient management that it just gets much easier if you have a third, like, in theory, a neutral third party do, rather than like a deeply interested, pharma company that creates a problem of incentives. So those are kind of the twin reasons why the CRO industry exists. And I think, something like this kind of should exist. I'm definitely not arguing with that. So you say I hate CROs. I think I've come to hate them. I don't think any of us really hated them initially. We just saw it as a problem of kind of misaligned incentives. But I've got to say, I've spoken to enough, and it's always the ex-CRO people. I've spoken to enough ex-CRO people, pretty senior, and they've just confirmed all of the worst things that we just hear terrible stories again and again. And I'm talking about instances where, essentially the CRO business model means that you make more money the worse a clinical trial goes, because you're getting paid by the hour essentially. And there are just all these instances where CROs have essentially deliberately sabotaged clinical trials they're responsible for in order to make a quick buck on, charging $5,000 for the weekly PowerPoint catch-up meeting, absurd stuff like that. This really affects patients, right? Think of an oncology, I heard about this in the context of a phase 2 clinical study for non-responders for breast cancer. These people are going to die unless they get, potentially this treatment on a clinical trial. So if you're finding a way to delay that clinical trial by a couple of months so you can make an extra 50, 100 grand, that is deeply unethical. And that's the sort of stuff that goes on. And that's why, we hate CROs.
The fundamental issue with the CRO, I think it was Warren Buffett, or is it Charlie Munger, that says that show me the incentives and I'll show you the results. Yeah. So the fundamental issue is that it's like a fee-based service model, that they are incentivized. If things go longer, they spend more time on things, they get paid more basically. And then your innovation here is that you are results-based or value-based type stuff, or what's the change? Yeah,
there's a couple of changes. So on the business model side, it's value-based. So we only ever do kind of a fixed price or a fixed quote for an entire clinical trial. So our customers have certainty over how much it'll cost them. And then they only actually pay us as we hit certain milestones. And these are the milestones that matter to them. So it is entirely kind of value-based. And, we are contractually obligated to deliver outcomes the customer cares about, as opposed to a CRO where it always blows my mind that they are contractually obligated to deliver a number of hours, but those are not at all linked to the outcomes a customer cares about. And it's so crazy to me that this has gone on, for as long as it has. I think pharma definitely bears some responsibility for just letting the state of affairs continue, just the way their procurement systems work. But the result is that to get a clinical trial to go right, and we hear this again and again from all of our customers, big and small, is they need to just micromanage a CRO, because the CRO, their only lever is just throwing hours in different places, but that doesn't actually necessarily mean they'll get any kind of result from it. So yeah, but you're right. It is fundamentally a problem of incentives. Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot about how people hate, in quotes, middlemen. They're across society, right? And if you really boil down a lot of businesses or services, they essentially operate as middlemen, right? As a really simple example, if you think of Uber, they're not the driver and they're not the person being driven around, right? They're connecting the two people and taking a slice off the top. Similarly in pharmaceuticals, more on the clinical side, you have pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, and people also hate on them and say they bloat the cost of healthcare in the US. And then I guess in your world, you've got these people, these CROs. Do you think that there is a they must be adding value to exist? When you have someone in the middle like this, there is something there? Like otherwise, it just logically doesn't make sense they would exist,
Yeah.
right? Or do you think it's like some perverse incentive structure that's caused them to stick around for so long?
I think in the early days of the industry, they were probably adding value where, giving kind of pharma and research sponsors that flexibility to kind of shift capital between programs. I mean, also, if you just think about like the resource allocation, if you're a biotech, you could build a team internally, but your need for like a clinical operations function might do this. Whereas if you work with an outsource company, you're effectively pooling resource, et cetera. But I think it's just gotten to the point where, because the barriers to entry in this industry are so high, and because pharma is frankly such a terrible customer for any kind of innovative business model or new entrant, the CROs just have this entrenched position. And again, like I vacillate between thinking like the model is kind of evil, and then there are like direct evil actors within CROs, and I think it's a bit of both. But like, the market forces have just meant that they're just in this kind of privileged position, and they've done what any kind of interested party would do and sort of take advantage of it.
And you said pharma are bad customers for any innovative business. What does that mean?
Oh boy. I mean, any of your listeners who maybe have a startup or who've sold to pharma and have seen what a pharma procurement process looks like, they just have incredibly heavy duty processes to buy anything. Entire divisions devoted to, quote, procurement. And what that boils down to is, if you're trying to sell kind of anything to pharma, you need to go through months and months of wrangling, of questionnaires, and all of the questions are designed to help bias them towards like the biggest, most established companies possible. So it's like, send me your audited financials for the last 5 years, and like why would a startup ever, pay to have their financials audited, right? So if you're trying to create a product where pharma is the natural customer, it's just much, much harder as a startup if pharma is the only customer you can sell to, because it's going to take just a lot of effort and time. And, those are things that you're resource limited or resource constrained by as a startup. So yeah. Whereas the big guys can just employ entire teams to deal with these pharma procurement processes.
Can you explain the impact or the scale of the clinical trials problem, sort of the bloat, the inefficiency in clinical trials, and how that feeds into the bigger picture of why it's becoming more expensive to bring new drugs to market? There was this JAMA paper I linked you that, from the headline at least, my understanding was that it says getting a drug to market costs between $1 to $3 billion, and the clinical trials, or at least the pivotal trials for that drug, they only make up about 1% of that cost, or around $20 million. So like from that, it seems like it's a relatively small issue in the bigger picture, but what's your take?
So the disconnect there. So you're right that like, I think the median cost for like a phase 3 pivotal study is about 20 million. The 2 billion per drug approved figure factors in all the drugs along the way that you still had to run clinical trials on that didn't make it. And this is the key thing, right? Because like, you only know if a drug works when you test it in humans. Like, you read the newspapers every day about like, oh, scientists have discovered a cure for cancer, but it only works in rats or like cell models. Like, you only know whether something works when you test it in humans. And I think that's the key problem with today's clinical trial ecosystem, where, and it's not, I think the operations, the part that we're disrupting is a big part of it. I'm not saying it's all of it, but it is the kind of biggest bottleneck to enabling kind of much faster, safer, more rapid iteration, such that you don't need to run 50 kind of very long, drawn out, expensive $20 million clinical trials per drug you actually approve. At the moment, you need to run, 30, 40 pivotal studies for each drug that gets approved. You total up the cost, that's $1 billion. But the individual study itself will be worth 20, 30 million. Yeah.
Can you talk about how you get your first clinical trial, or you get your first sort of pilot or taste of success? It looks like from your site that you've initially focused on more digital health or digital drug or like decentralized type trials. Is that correct? Is that like a good way in?
So yeah, that was our like entry point. So when we started the company, our North Star was always like, okay, we know to make a difference in this space, you need to be in charge of the entire clinical trial. That's really hard, particularly for a startup. And so then we thought like, okay, what's the simplest clinical trial that we can do end to end and kind of prove out the model? And so yeah, exactly as you said, we focused initially on digital health, digital therapeutics, kind of not quite food supplements, but sort of functional food products or like technically food supplement products that were making health claims, registered health claims. And so, our early cohort of clinical trials were all in those areas. I guess shout out to maybe Habitual, a UK company, our first ever end-to-end clinical trial customer whose study we finished and went super well. But very grateful that there were a handful of companies there who were willing to trust us with something super important and take a chance on a new provider.
Fundamentally, how do you compete with companies like IQVIA, who probably have coffee budgets or printer budgets, which are bigger than all your budget combined? Like, what are you going to do there?
Printer budget is apt because so much of it's a whole so much of clinical trials today are still run on paper, which is crazy. The glib answer is that we don't. We've started competing with them. We didn't until about 6 or 8 months ago. But now that we're running phase 1 to 4 drug studies for major pharma biotech sponsors, we have and are directly competing with the IQVIAs, the Parexels of the world, and we're starting to beat them, which is awesome. So as an aside, we're in this sort of final selection for quite a big phase 2 kind of study, and let's just say we know some folks. We're competing against one of the biggest CROs for it, and I just got a text message from some of the folks at this big CRO who were yeah, everyone's shit scared because they know who you are now, and they know that there's just no way they can compete. So it's really gratifying. Whereas 6 to 8 months ago, I doubt they even knew we existed. So I think that just to directly answer your question, how we compete is, we're never going to match their footprint, their printer budget, or not never, but at the moment. But we just present an overwhelmingly stronger case on the things that really matter to the customer. So that's timelines, so how quickly we can start up the study, recruit patients, close the study out, and quality of data. And the way we do the timelines is, we have access to real patient data. All the assumptions we make, everything we present, is all sense checked against millions of real health records that we have access to, and not just access to, but we can reach out to those patients and recruit them onto our clinical trials. And then on quality of data, so just our software platform, how it captures data, stores it in a compliant way, and a lot of other features that spin off that. But it is hard, and the objection we always deal with is no one gets fired for hiring IBM. In this space, no one gets fired for hiring IQVIA. It's just that effect, and it's just something you've got to grind through.
So can we talk about the big vision with Lindus? So you keep on going how you're going now, and you are a CRO / anti-CRO, but you're essentially providing this service for people, and it's a huge market, right? But in terms of a big rocket ship vision, is it that you eventually vertically integrate and have your own pipelines, or what's the next step?
Yeah, so the vision is we just become the default provider for any company looking to validate a health or biotech product, because we can do it so much faster, because we can evidence that running a clinical trial on our platform leads to materially higher quality data. At the moment, our vision isn't to become almost become a pharma company where we're sort of buying our own drug products and then running them on our platform. That's definitely an avenue we could go down. A company I think is interesting in the space is TrialSpark. But they did go down that path about 4 or 5 years ago, and I think it's an interesting path. But I look at how much there is to do just in the arena of clinical trials, and that's more than enough for one company to chew. And at the moment, our DNA isn't the kind of scientific inspiration or inspiration behind a certain target or drug. So I think we're just, at the moment, we're squarely focused on just executing better, faster, more effective clinical trials.
What did you take from your time as a VC, and what have you brought to Lindus? Are there any things that you think you've been a bit smarter with compared to other founders who didn't have the VC background that you had from being on the other side of the table, potentially?
Yeah, all of the memes roasting VCs who try and be operators are just running through my head. They're all unfair. I mean, I think, there's a lot of tactical stuff around fundraising, and it kind of bothers me that there are still loads of unwritten rules when it comes to fundraising, where if you've been a VC, you kind of know how to maybe avoid some of the potholes, or run a good fundraising, or run a tight fundraising process. So that definitely helps. I think also like, just having been, as VCs can only be like, very, very tangent or like a very ringside seat to some pretty cool companies, kind of helps give you that lesson for like, okay, here's what a high performing culture looks like. Here's what, hypergrowth looks like. Here's what, here's how things can go wrong. So that definitely helps. But I would say, clearly like the memes have a point where it's deficient in a lot of ways, because like a VC firm is like ultimately quite a weird organization where it's very like zero sum. It's very kind of tend to be very small, quite political. It's not really like you're kind of building a growth business, which is so, in that way, it's the job of VC itself isn't a perfect kind of setup for being an entrepreneur. But yeah.
What are the potholes that you avoided?
Oof, okay. So there's some that actually, so I think there were potholes that we knew were potholes, but still fell into anyway. The classic things like hiring too senior too early. This is a mistake like almost everyone makes. I could even see companies like work with as a VC making it, and we still made the mistakes. And it's like, you start the company, you're like, shit, there's this whole area. I'm not from this whole business function. Here be dragons. Like, what do I do? Let me just hire someone who like really knows this area, and they'll figure it out for me. Like, no, wrong. That fails every time. And we made that mistake a couple of times. And then I guess maybe on the fundraising front, it's like very tactical things. Like the classic one that I think some people make is like, you're either fundraising and your time maybe as one of the founders is like 80% on fundraising, or you're not, and there's no middle ground. Like that's the way to play it. But the mistake is, you kind of half fundraise, and we actually made this as well. We have like early conversations with VCs before we really know what the pitch is, and that kind of puts them off, and then we sort of poison the well a bit. But yeah, those were some of the mistakes we've made. As I say, even though we should have known better, and maybe I kind of knew they were mistakes from my time in VC. But yeah, at least we won't be making them again, or at least I hope. Yeah.
Wait, sorry. The downside there is having conversations with half-baked ideas, and when you're not ready to kind of pull the trigger, that's a bad thing, because that isn't obvious to me. It seems like having those warm, sort of friendly conversations in the build-up and doing it as you go by would be beneficial. No.
For us, at least, it's almost always been a bad idea. I think it's particularly bad in the early stages when, essentially the VC is backing you just based on your pitch, really. Because for them, like, the better your pitch, the more likely you are to raise a Series A, which boosts their portfolio value. But anyway, so, it was definitely a huge mistake for us. Like literally every VC that, we'd had like early discussions with when the pitch wasn't ready, like they were like always the first VCs to kind of, or like turned us down very quickly. And I don't blame them for it, because our pitch just wasn't coherent, And even though you can go to a VC and say like, look, we don't have a pitch ready, this is just a casual conversation, they'll always judge you by the standard of all the other pitches they're seeing. So I think it's almost always a bad move. I think it can maybe works like slightly later, like Series B stage. And we are deliberately having just a few, literally just a small handful of conversations with VCs, generally kind of more senior VCs, so that when we're raising our Series B round, they kind of know us already and they've seen, a level of progress. But even so, I do so like very sparingly, and I definitely not, if you're having like early a non-fundraising general chat with a VC, like heavily caveated up front, just be like, look, we don't have a pitch. I can tell you about the market. I'm not gonna tell you very much about our company. Certainly not gonna tell you any metrics. I think that's the way to do it.
One thing I find interesting about Lindus, and I find the maybe the positioning and PR side quite fascinating, but you've pitched yourself as an anti-CRO, right? Even though, again, you are basically a CRO. And I find that interesting because I think it hits on this chord of tribes. Seth Godin has really good writing on this in terms of how you can, as a business, position yourself not only as, like we make money and we pay you, but as like a tribe, like that people follow, or like a cult, or just people in a very positive sense, that people really get behind the vision. And one of his key points in that book is that you need to be very clear about what you are not rather than what you are. Because I think a lot of people can say, you see this all the time with corporate BS, like statements being like, our values are like integrity. Yeah. I think Enron's like some of their key values were like integrity, honesty, openness, or whatever. And then you see how that ends. And another part of it is that I think you are actually a lot clearer when you say what you are not rather than what you are. For example, if you were talking to an alien and you were trying to describe the difference between a dog and a cat, you can be telling them a dog is a four-legged creature with fur and they're very friendly and they hang around your house. And the alien will feel like they understand what a dog is, but then the moment they see a dog and a cat together, they're not going to be able to differentiate. So I think that's like an interesting position. But then maybe perhaps what I would speculate would be the downside is that when you pitch yourself as like a disruptor, or that you are not this thing, or you are the movement against CROs, then, I mean, they're going to be your colleagues, they're going to be your business partners, etc. So there's like a bit of an L or a loss you take there. So like, has that been a very intentional decision for you? And do you kind of agree with my analysis?
I totally agree with your analysis. It has been intentional. So the problem we have is that, I agree with you. Like, I think we can go too far. The problem is that when we use any other words other than CRO to describe ourselves, people are kind of confused about what you do, because I'm serious. Like, there are so many different kind of offerings that make up, a clinical trial. And so the CRO is just a useful shorthand. But at the same time, like, CROs are not well thought of in the industry. Like, I don't think I've met anyone in the hundreds of thousands of conversations who's had like just overall positive things to say about them. So that, I think that kind of explains, like, but I agree with you that there, you can definitely over rotate on defining yourself by what you're not. I mean, have you seen any of the companies who get the balance right, do you think?
Yeah, so the ones that immediately come to mind are like in the maybe D size space. That there's a couple of good ones in there that aren't coming to mind.
Like Molecule.
Which ones?
Or,
yeah, Molecule. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other ones are maybe the more metabolic, healthy / lifestyle / N=1 personalized medicine ones that are a bit more like, we are against the medical establishment, right? We are against this kind of population-based treatment of you, treating you just like a number. I mean, one that immediately comes to mind is, say, Zoe, where they're very clear, like, this is like personalized to you. Like, we are going to measure your metrics and you're going to get this diet that's like personal for you. It's not just what this food pyramid that's been paid by loads of outside interests and influenced by big dairy or whatever have suggested. This is for you. Whether or not there's like enough evidence behind that or not, I think it's a nice story they make. So maybe it's something about the enemy being vague is helpful as well. Like, when you see a lot of conspiratorial people talk about perhaps like, the big man or the big, like, the establishment, and it's quite vague. So I think it's easier to rail on those more than specific
that's
people.
Definitely fair. And I do think one thing that's quite funny with our positioning is, we are pretty open about being anti-CRO. The other most negative people are other people, like CRO people. Like, the number of times we've had people reach out, or just like, like talking to someone who used to work for Sabine, who works there currently, like, we're interviewing them and they're like, I've got to say, I love your guys' positioning. Here's all this shitty behavior that I saw. Like, here's all this like horrible ways in which the CRO model is broken. Like, we've literally had people say, like, from who are at a CRO currently, like, I'll do anything to work for you guys. I think my company is evil. I want to help, I want to help, like, redress the balance. So it's, we're kind of aware we're we do lean into heavily defining ourselves in opposition to the industry incumbents, but it's the nature. It seems to the nature of the industry. It seems to mean that it kind of works in this case. That was my co-founder, Michael. But I think it has worked well for us. I do agree with you that you do run a risk, and I think we'd love to find, or I think over time, we'll develop maybe a slightly more nuanced tagline that's like less outright negative. But for the moment, it seems a pretty good. It seems to really jive with what we're trying to do.
So, Meri, do you have any billion-dollar ideas in bio or health, things that you might be approaching if you weren't working on Lindus, or big open goals that you see huge opportunity in?
Yeah, a few. They're not going to be very coherent because Lindus is, we're fully consumed with Lindus Health at the moment. I guess I'd say more there are sort of like big problem areas that I'm interested in or worried about maybe. I think one is definitely fertility. I read a book which really kind of reconfigured my matrix on this subject a couple of years ago called The Decadent Society and by Russ Douthit. And it very persuasively made the case that a lot of like problems, a lot of just the fundamental like kind of stagnation that I think we all like intuitively see around just general quality of lifestyle in like the cultural area as well, technological perhaps. It all kind of stems back to like demographics and an imbalanced population pyramid. And we're just in this scenario where, you know, we're essentially 5 to 10 years behind maybe Korea and Japan in terms of birth rates, where, you know, populations are shrinking and you have fewer and fewer kind of working age people able to support older people. And so I think, you know, therefore, if you think about like what we're doing at Lindus Health is like finding this like key bottleneck or pressure point in this whole industry. I kind of think fertility is like another like really fundamental pressure point or just, you know, bottleneck. And so, yeah, so, you know, more concretely, I think there's a bunch of things around, you know, fundamental technology breakthroughs around IVF and maybe surrogacy, where, you know, we've had IVF for a while. It doesn't work perfectly. There's some stuff to do there. There's some kind of interesting models like Gaia is one company in the UK that's doing some interesting things around, you know, not really innovating in the fundamental, at least as far as I know, in like the fundamental tech layer, but more like the experience layer, wrapping it around insurance, which I also think can be impactful. Yeah, and then there's some also models around, you know, actually how we do IVF and maybe even how we, you know, not just look at it as a problem of you know, fertility and helping couples conceive, well, that's very important, but also like, you know, how we use how can I put this, how we use, you know, all the tools we have to ensure that you know, pregnancies are successful and just that, you know, people's families are set up to be as healthy and happy as possible. So anyway, there's a ton of stuff there. I haven't had much time to think about it, but it's an area that I'd love to work on one day.
Awesome. And I suspect you're not going to give me a good answer for this due to humility, but what are any habits or ways you approach problems, or what are things you do that you think have helped you get to where you are today? Like if we were, you know, looking back in 20 years and we're like, oh, Meri's this great guy. Let's root back to like maybe some of the key frameworks he has in his head. What would come to mind? I mean, Michael Young, your co-founder, he said you're never accepting of the status quo. You're always pushing for improvement, and you've got clear vision and push towards that. Mitty had loads of really nice things to say about you. He said that like one of the other thing is that your incredible traits is just attracting high caliber people, employees, advisors, customers, etc. That you
it feels like a humble brag.
Yeah. And then he also said around that whilst other people are busy posturing and doing PR, you're just hard at work running hundreds of trials and getting on with it and achieving great things. But like, what do you think are things that have helped you?
So, okay. I mean, I think if I look at like the company as a whole, you know, I feel like we've moved pretty quickly. You know, we're 2.5 years old. We've been consistently ahead of certainly like the targets and stuff we presented to investors. And you know, I'm not sure I embody like high speed necessarily, but I think maybe as co-founders, you know, we've all really pushed that as a value and made sure that everyone we hire kind of really embodies that like bias to action. And it's not just speed. I mean, it's also, you know, I think it's agency as well. People who are just not comfortable with the status quo, and if they see a problem, they can't help but want to go and solve it. Maybe just more specifically about me, I think a mental model that I find very useful when dealing with problems is just thinking about things from the highest level of abstraction possible. Like you're never going to have like all of the data. Decision paralysis is probably like the thing that kills people and companies, frankly, or leads to a lot of like lost productivity. And so just being able to step back and go like, okay, like what are the 2 or 3 biggest factors or like biggest things here? Let's just make a decision on that basis and not worry about, you know, get lost in all of the details. Thinking about mental models is actually one that I love, which I don't think many people are aware of, but it's called a OODA loop, OODA, observe, orient, decide, act. And, you know, probably America's greatest military theorist is this like crazy guy called John Boyd in the sort of 50s and 60s who came up with all these frameworks. And, you know, you can sort of see how they've been applied. Like they've been applied in the business world as like agile, but I actually think like the original frameworks he came up with were most impactful. So like, you know, one of the ones we use a lot is the OODA loop. And it goes back to this kind of, you know, it's super important that you just observe, kind of get the data you need to make a decision, make the decision, act on it, and that's super key. And I think like nothing kills like productivity or just like teams or cultures more than like when you make a decision but then don't act on it, because then that leaves room for you to go back and like second guess yourself and blah blah blah. So I think that's also been a really useful framework for just how myself and just how the company works.
Wait, that sounds pretty obvious stuff. Is the key thing there that you not only observe and decide on things, but you actually do the action as well? Is that like the key part, that you complete it?
That's probably it's you go through the whole cycle. Because like something that I've experienced before is, you kind of, maybe you're in a meeting or something and the group comes to a decision, which is already like, anyway, you come to a decision and then you just don't act on it immediately, and then an hour later you're like, oh wait, is that the right decision? And you just spend tons of time second guessing yourself. And I think that kind of decision paralysis can be fatal for any company, but certainly a startup where you need to move fast. Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. You can find all my links by going to bigpicturemedicine.co.uk. And if you are listening to the audio version, you can find the video feed on YouTube and on Spotify by searching Big Picture Medicine. You can see my pretty face. And I've got a favor to ask. If you've been enjoying the podcast, then please just send it to someone in your life who you think might enjoy it. Send them this episode, another episode, the link to the whole podcast, whatever. But that would be really, really helpful. Okay, see you next time. Thank you.